Thank you, Chairman, and thank you and Senator Carper for holding the hearing. Incredibly important issue. I want to talk about something that is specific to a threat to our infrastructure, and that's the increasing evidence out there that we have ransomware that has infected not just individuals' computers, but commercial systems. And I recently had the opportunity to get a briefing from the FBI on this, and I noticed that they sent out something on their website just a couple weeks ago warning people. There's a unique, I suppose, warning out from the Canadian government and our government right now on ransomware based on some information. To me, this seems to be a growing problem, and yet it's underreported because my understanding is a lot of companies are not, eager to talk about their ransomware payments. For those who don't follow this, this is when you have an infection in your system and you find your system has been encrypted to the point that it's blocked, and you get a notice saying, if you pay this amount of money during this time period, and sometimes there's a clock that shows you, apparently what your time period is, we will pull the malware off and you'll be able to operate your system. There have been some unfortunate instances of this that have gotten a lot of attention. One was the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center in LA earlier this year. For weeks, they had to shuttle their patients to other facilities because they were locked down with a malware problem. So I guess my question probably is best to you, Mr. Farmer, because you're here as chair of the Partnership for Critical Infrastructure Security. I'm sure you've seen this report, the ICIT, which is the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, issued this report, and its headline is kind of jarring. It says 2016 will be the year ransomware holds America hostage. Maybe the title of your next book, Ted. So, Mr. Farmer, could you tell us, and I know this data is difficult to come by because, again, it's not always reported, but based on what the FBI has said and based on this report and based on some of these specific instances that have come to the media's attention, what's the nature of the problem? Is it, in fact, increasing dramatically, as some say? And what are some of the ways in which we, as legislators, could be more effective in dealing with it?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I do think the problem is expanding, and the FBI's attention to it, DHS's attention to it, they're reflective of that. The media coverage highlights those cases where ransomware has not only had an effect, but actually worked. And I think like anything else, so long as the tactic is working, the interest in pursuing it is going to expand. On reporting, there's two avenues to focus on in terms of whether incidents get reported. Often an affected organization will report a matter to the FBI as a law enforcement concern. The FBI will handle that matter through its investigative procedures with the affected entity. Whether it gets shared more broadly is a determination that entity might make with its sector partners, with DHS. But I think there's a lot of reporting which is informing the FBI's efforts in providing these awareness bulletins in terms of entities affected by this, trying to deal with the problem, and seeking law enforcement assistance. So I think on that side, you've got a lot of good reporting, and because of the manner in which FBI handles investigations, that's generally with the affected entity. Now, because of the FBI's experience, and I give the FBI a lot of credit here, they've done a great deal of work in taking what they're learning from these law enforcement investigations, stripping out the indicators of the affected organizations, and then publishing for wider dissemination guidelines, advisories, in particular papers that focus on indicators. One of the things we focus on in the Cross-Sector Council is we're not necessarily interested in who the perpetrators are. That's investigative information that's not necessarily important to us. What is important is the tactics. How is it that these events are taking place? And in particular, how does the intrusion occur onto the affected networks? And the focus of our cybersecurity priorities collectively is on that aspect. What can we learn from all of that work the FBI does in its investigative efforts? As I mentioned earlier, from all that assistance DHS provides in terms of on-site work with affected organizations and sharing indicators, let's take that next analytical step and understand better how these events happen. So what makes it to the media is the effect. The computers are no longer accessible. The hospital can't get to the records. So the effect makes it. But what's far more important from a cybersecurity perspective is how did that happen? And I think as Mr. Koppel can point out just from the work that he did in connection with this book, too often the means of intrusion are perilously simple. And there's a lot of work that we can do based on that next level of analysis, understanding what those tactics are that are used most often, understanding what vulnerabilities are most often exploited. That can be patched in advance. Understanding what protective measures, when that support is extended, were found lacking. I'll give a comparative example. In Australia, their equivalent of the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team did analysis of times when the Australian government, I think it's a signals director in Australia, had to provide assistance to private entities in Australia affected by cyber attacks. And that analysis found that in 85% of those cases, that if 4 categories of protective measures had been taken, those attacks never would have materialized as they did. And so we look at that from a U.S. perspective. We credit DHS, FBI for that expansive work, and we said, let's take that next step of analysis and build a very good cyber threat profile that we can pair with the cybersecurity framework issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and sectors could then look at that and say, for organizations of varying sizes, this is what the threat looks like. These are what the vulnerabilities are that are most often exploited. These are the protective measures you really need to pay attention to, and marry those with objectives of the framework.
Mr. Farmer, I would say, with all due respect to that analysis that's been done and the information that's out there, I'm looking at a bulletin right now that's on the FBI website.
Right.
It's tips for dealing with ransomware threat, and yet it's dramatically increasing, as I understand it, and as this report says, and I think you've confirmed that.
Right.
So despite our ability to understand how these ransomware attacks are happening, and this information that's out there, it's expanding. And I think one reason it is, from what I understand, is that sometimes the ransomware folks are asking for a relatively small amount of money, small enough that, frankly, they're not being investigated. So let's say $10,000. I'm told that's kind of the sweet spot. My view would be we need to up the enforcement of that and investigate all of them, because it's sort of the broken windows,
Well,
I guess, analogy on the policing
Yes,
side.
sir.
You can't let some of these ransomware happen. And then second, how do you encourage people to report? As you're saying, some do report as a law enforcement matter, some don't, particularly if it's at this relatively low level. And then the final thing is, and this is where I think Ted Koppel's done a great service, is talking about what restrictions are there that we could help with, both at the regulatory level and at the legislative level, to allow people to protect themselves better. The great example that I have in some research that my team did was hospitals that are told under the HIPAA rules they have trouble defending themselves following these very tips that are being laid out. And I think you wrote something about actually an Ohio incident where there was a brownout in Ohio, and some regulatory issues affected the way people were able to defend themselves. Is that accurate, or am I missing the
No, I think you're accurate, sir, in terms of the nature of the threat. You're accurate as well in terms of the expansion. I do believe a similar widespread publication of investigative actions and successful prosecutions that result in serious penalties for this behavior would be helpful and as a deterrent factor. I will say this, though. I'm not.
So-
I don't agree, though, that.
So going after people more aggressively
Yes.
who are participating in this and increasing the fines or the criminal penalties.
Increasing the criminal penalties, but also taking that step, too, of ensuring that those sorts of penalties are well known. So again, often the focus of attention is on what happened in the particular event, what the impacts were. We don't pay enough attention afterward to how that was resolved in terms of someone was prosecuted, someone went to jail because of the actions they took. And there's one area, sir, where I do want to make a point. I don't think we have done so well yet at highlighting for organizations across the board, particularly those smaller in size that don't have a lot of resources. Hospitals become a good target because they have limited means to protect themselves. And I think we really need to focus on understanding better through analysis what the intrusions mechanisms are that enable the ransomware attack to happen, and help organizations understand what they can be doing better in terms of narrowing the term that gets used, the attack surface, narrowing that opportunity. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. We do a really good job of highlighting ransomware as a problem. We don't do nearly as well a job of saying, this is how ransomware intrusions based on analysis are happening, and here are some things you can do to narrow the risk profile of your organization.
Let's follow up on that. My time has expired. Again, thank you all for being here, and I think you're right. It was hospitals, maybe among institutions that were most vulnerable initially, and smaller hospitals that didn't have a more sophisticated system. My understanding is it's now moving to larger hospitals and other entities that have even a bigger impact on our critical infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and maybe we'll follow up, Mr. Farmer, if that's okay, with some follow-up questions.